welcome to all of you, and I certainly want to welcome our speaker today, who, if you've lived in Kansas City any length of time, you know that Bob Berkebile is a preeminent architect in this city and community, and he deserves every bit of it. So it's my honor and pleasure to be able to introduce him. He is here today thanks to our resident and lifelong learning committee meeting, Myron Silden, so Myron deserves credit for that as well. Let me tell you a little bit about Bob. I apologize if this was a little long, but he's got such an impressive resume that it's very difficult for me to edit it down to anything very short. He's a graduate of the University of Kansas School of Architecture. He's professionally registered in Arkansas, Kansas, Michigan, Missouri, Montana, North Carolina, South Carolina, and so forth. That gives you an idea. He's been around the country. Some of his select experience is with the Kansas City International Airport, the Kansas City Zoo, Bartle Hall Ballroom expansion, Lewis and Clark State Office Building with the Missouri Department of Natural Resources in Jefferson City, Greensburg, Kansas. Remember when it about blew away? A number of years ago, 90% of it was gone. He and his firm went out there and really helped those folks bring it back, and that was wonderful. Any list of accomplished, influential architects and environmentalists includes Bob Berkebile. Highly regarded by fellow professionals and the recipient of numerous awards, Bob focuses on improving the quality of life in our society with the integrity and spirit of his work. And he has demonstrated that integrity, I know personally, many times. He is a founding principal of BNIM, which at one time was known as Berkebile Nilsson Emmonshoe, and I think McDowell. But like all the firms now, they have these taglines, so it's just BNIM. He received the 2011 American Institute of Architects Firm Award, and he brings more than 4 decades of experience to the architectural profession. He is founding chairman of the American Institute of Architects National Committee on the Environment, and was also instrumental in the formation of the U.S. Green Building Council and its LEED rating system. With that, let me introduce Bob Berkebile.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, great. So I'm delighted to be here. When Myron called, I think my assignment was to talk about climate. And I'm prepared to do that, but I wanted to start with this image because I believe, as it will be more clear later, or as was documented in the Kansas City Star not too long ago in a talk unlike this, I raised a question, which was, why are we not all shitting our pants? And that made the Star the next day, and so I've been outed on this. I think he cleaned it up since it's a family newspaper. I think he actually said, soiling my trousers. But I asked the question, climate threatens to eliminate human life on this planet. And I want to share that with you. And the reason I chose this title is because I think it is up to us and your children and their children as to whether or not we actually remain successful as a human species on this planet. But we can't wait for our grandchildren in this case, because the next decade will be the deciding factor as to whether or not human life will ultimately be successful. And I'll try to make that case as I go through this presentation. Of course, we all come to our positions through a variety of experiences. And I'm going to document a few as epiphanies or aha moments. So, like most people, I was influenced by my own parents. My dad was a third-generation German craftsman contractor, and my mom was a school teacher. But my mom, more importantly, taught me to observe nature. She would take us into the forest behind our house and teach us where to look for morel mushrooms the following year, or the best wild raspberries, or the best blackberries, etc. And by learning those observation strategies, I was well prepared to meet this gentleman who I met at KU while I was there, Buckminster Fuller. And Bucky, I had the great good fortune to be there at a time when our dean made a deal with Bucky Fuller to come to KU and explore a new idea he had for structures. And he just selected 15 of us to spend full time with Bucky while he was there. And that literally changed my life. He taught me about systems thinking. He, as you know, probably had written an operating manual for Spaceship Earth. He was very concerned about this planet and its future. And he said, you know, we've been given this beautiful spaceship traveling through space, but no one gave us the operating instructions. And I think we better figure this out pretty soon, because I think we're wasting the resources on this planet at a rate that we will overrun. And if we do, we're not going to have a very long flight. The spaceship will continue to move, but the question is, will the astronauts be on board? And that's still the question today. To give you some idea, we'd be in studio and he'd hear the weather forecaster saying, the storm's blowing out of the southwest. And Bucky would shout out, no, it's sucking from the northeast. Meaning there's a low pressure center in the northeast and nature's working to achieve balance. Or one of my colleagues pointed out the beautiful sunset to her kids. And Bucky said, no, the sun is not setting. The planet is rotating to eclipse our view of the sun. That'll give you an idea. But he taught me some fundamental principles about this beautiful planet and about how to observe life as a complete operating system. As John Muir said, everything is interconnected and interdependent. And we, as a human race, have just chosen to ignore that for way too long. My second epiphany came about 14 years later, when the Hyatt Hotel suffered a major collapse. I spent the longest night of my life on the rescue team, removing more than 100 dead people and more than 200 seriously injured people. And of course, the first question was, did I kill all these people? But as that question was answered by failure analysis experts and others, the questions that stuck in my mind were all new to me. What is the real impact of our designs on the people we intend to serve? Are we improving their health, their well-being, their quality of life, the vitality of their neighborhood, their city, the watershed, airshed, job shed, planet, or not? That was 1981, and as near as I could tell in 1981, there were no answers to those questions. But fortunately for me, the Smithsonian published an anniversary issue that year. And they named 6 people on the planet most likely to change the outcome of the human story. And so, as you might imagine, I think some of the attorneys might remember, I don't, but I think there was about $2.6 billion worth of lawsuits against me and the firm. So I was spending most of my time with attorneys and insurance company people. But I had about 15% of my time left over, and I used that time to start calling the people that were identified by Smithsonian as the people most likely to change the outcome of the human story. And the first was Amory Lovins at the Rocky Mountain Institute. And the second was Wes Jackson at the Land Institute in Salina, the food geneticist. And the third was Tom Lovejoy at the Smithsonian himself, etc. And they all pretty much had the same story. So Amory's response was, Bob, I don't have the answers to these questions, but they're very important. They haven't been asked before. And whenever you get free of those attorneys, please come to Colorado and I'll help you. And all the others essentially said the same thing, and I did. And that became part of a huge international journey. And probably most significant in helping me answer those questions were my own colleagues at B&IM Architects. So they really became part of my core team in trying to figure out what is happening, how do we affect this by design, how can we change the outcome of what Bucky said would not be a very good ending without significant change. And so as we have done this, we've created a number of things, they're all abbreviations there. The AIA's National Committee on the Environment. I just opened the board meeting in Washington literally this morning, fortunately by video conference, so I could be here. But it's now the 30th anniversary of us launching the National Committee on the Environment. And then a few years later, the U.S. Green Building Council and their lead energy environmental design guide, rating system, and then the Living Building Challenge, and on and on. Lots of tools and issues have been generated globally in trying to answer those questions that came to me that night. Other people just showed up in my life that were very useful after that event. And these are two of them, two maybe the most influential. At the top is Leon Shenandoah, whom the National Geographic called the Chief of Chiefs. He was an Iroquois chief, keeper of the flame, meaning the eternal truth or spirit. And Robert Mueller, at the time, Undersecretary General of the United Nations. They came to Kansas City for the first Global Peace event. And I was hosting a meeting for them to introduce the leadership of the city. And it was a breakfast meeting. So at breakfast, I invited people to think about, we were having this breakfast with our guests in the heartland of America. And that was pretty much all I said, and I invited them to enjoy their breakfast. After breakfast, Robert Mueller spoke eloquently. And after he spoke, I stood up to thank everyone for coming and to thank him for coming and speaking. And I realized neither Indian, Leon, or his guide, helper, Jake Swamp, who at the time was chief of the Mohawks. And I asked if either of them would like to say anything. And Jake said, I think Chief Shenandoah has something to share. And so this Indian chief, this famous chief, stood up slowly, but once he was standing, he was very powerful. And he said, you know, I don't know about the other tables, but I know about my table and this one right here. We missed Bob's point at breakfast. We started talking about symbols, like the Big Apple in New York, the Arch in St. Louis, and we got all involved in trying to create some symbol for Kansas City. And he said, there's something you need to know. I am old, and when I travel, I grow weary. The exception has been when I come to Kansas City. When I'm here, my heart grows strong, and my spirit soars like an eagle. You need to do something to remind yourselves of this and teach your children. This is the most important thing on the planet today, is this heart spirit. So I stood up then to thank him, and I realized as I was standing up, words probably wouldn't be coming out of my mouth anytime soon. And the first face I saw was Joanne Collins, a black city councilwoman, and tears were falling off her face. And the second was Al Morrow, who was the foundations guy at Kansas City Southern Railroad. And he clearly had the same reaction I did. And so fortunately, Robert Mueller took me off the hook, and he stood up and said, Bob, I would like to add to that. I've traveled all over the world for the UN, and I have exactly the same experience as Chief Shenandoah. This city has something really unique with this heart spirit. And you're an architect, you can figure this out. You need to plant a row of trees around the city in the shape of a heart big enough to be seen from outer space. And off they flew. And I worked on that concept for actually a couple years. And what I determined is, even if I could have organized all the real estate and management to create that ring of trees, and we had planted it, you could not see it entering and leaving the city by commercial air. What you would have seen is a row of curving trees disappearing over the horizon. You could have seen it from outer space on a day with no clouds. But I've, after a lot of research, determined it should be about 20 acres. And right here, southwest of the airport, we planted that heart forest over about 5 years with thousands of Kansas Cityans, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and others, planting saplings about this big. Today those trees are about 75 feet tall, plus or minus. And here's one of the early star reports and what we were doing that you see over on the right. I share this because now here we are decades later, and I've now traveled all over the planet, every continent, met lots of people, learned lots of things, and I'm even more aware now that they were exactly right than I was at that time. And we have something here that's unique that the rest of the world doesn't yet enjoy, and it's even more critical today than it was when they first shared that idea with me. So the firm, in trying to answer those questions with me, has gotten lots of national and international attention. And we've created lots of programs with lots of help from literally thousands of people all over the planet trying to change the future outcome of humankind on the planet by changing the way we design and build communities. During that time, actually in 92, 93, the National Science Foundation took me to Antarctica. And the reason for that trip is they wanted us to rethink U.S. installations on the ice. We had been criticized internationally for bad behavior, basically. To give you an idea, we were putting our human waste and kitchen waste in the bay where they're doing all the research for marine biology. That's not a very good idea. We had an old nuclear facility on the side of the mountain that was old technology and was leaking into the earth on the side of that mountain, which once we were caught had to be dismantled, put on a ship in pieces, and returned to California to be disposed of as radioactive material, and on and on. So on my visit, I was looking at the different facilities, but more importantly, I arrived at the time, the year, this was 1992, and then I left in 93, that carbon for the first time exceeded 350 parts per million. And so let me just share with you briefly. We hear a lot. There's no such thing as global warming. It's a natural cycle. The history of this planet, things warm up and cool down in long cycles. And this is just a warming cycle. So here's 450,000 years of evidence. And this comes from ice cores and drilling and from outer space, all kinds of samples. When I was there, they did not have all these samples. When I came back to the U.S., all full of this new information, and some of my best friends and scientists and colleagues said, Bob, we love you, but don't believe those guys. They are crazy. They've created large computer models, very sophisticated, but they've had to make assumptions because they have no real data from ice cores a mile deep, from outer space, from the bottom of the ocean. So today, we now have real samples from all those places, and their models were an understatement. And they have been exceeded, in fact, by what's happened. They predicted precisely the increase in the incidence and intensity of hurricanes, tornadoes, and weather events. So what does that look like? Here's that 450,000 years, and you see the blue cycle of warming and cooling, but you see here on our watch, in our lifetime, that it spiked to something that's never before been seen. And that's what's creating all the ruckus that we see in rising waters, melting ice, more heat, more drought, etc. And frankly, more in the intensity of storms is a very big factor we might talk a little bit more about later. So you can see this level of 350, which is everyone had determined at least 10 to 15 years before my visit, that was the maximum that would support human life over time. And when I was there at 357, we started developing these strategies to bend that back down over time. Those were 3 different scenarios that got created within 6 months of my visit on the ice, some of which we started while I was there. But I realized then that what Bucky was talking about, even though he didn't have all the benefit of all this science, was exactly right. And ironically, I and the firm have been responding to that change now ever since 1993 when I came back. Our firm has worked now in 12 different communities in post-disaster environments. So the one that was mentioned earlier, Greensburg, is a good example. Some bigger are Houston, New Orleans, etc. And they were important but I will share Greensburg in more detail. You see on the upper right, I'm standing on Main Street looking north at the grain elevator the day after the storm. That's what Greensburg looked like. And the only thing standing is the grain elevator. So we learned what we already knew, that is reinforced concrete cylinders attached is a really strong structural shape. But pretty much everything else didn't work. Margaret Wheatley, who is a sociologist, done a lot of really important work, said, "There's no power greater than a community discovering what it cares about." And I had done several communities before Greensburg, so I'd developed some skills in this, but basically the first time I did a community, I had experts from all over the planet. Literally, our planner was from India and so on. And I needed a way for this expert team flying in to get to know that unique place, and that place happened to be Pattonsburg, Illinois, that had been flooded out after the Great Mississippi Flood in '93, had been flooded out 8 of the last 10 years. So I needed from my experts to know who these people were, the uniqueness of that particular place on the planet, in order to develop options that might work for them. And so the way we did that is we got them in the largest gymnasium in the region, and we spent a Saturday together, and we asked only 3 questions. The first was, why do you love this place? Why are you living here? And they would go back in breakout groups and answer the question and come back and report to the community. The second question was, what are the barriers? Why are your kids going away to college and never moving back? Why are property values declining, etc.? And the third question was, if you could do one thing to change the outcome, what would that be? Same process. Well, it worked for me and my colleagues. We learned a lot about them in one long day. What I didn't expect is they, almost to the last person, told me they had never felt more like a community. They had given them permission to share things that were really important to them that they had never shared before, and they found a lot of other people in the community shared those same opinions, but they had always been reluctant to share them. So all of a sudden they knew all the good things and all the bad things, and they could together begin addressing what they wanted to do about them. And that's one of the things I've learned in all 12 of these communities. What really happens in that kind of a disaster is nature reveals what was already obsolete and broken in the community. And I mean making physical issues. It becomes instantly apparent after one of those events what that looks like. So they, in dialogue, then began exploring what they wanted to do in building back. And over time, they, through a number of meetings, a number of explorations, to become the greenest city in America. They were the first city in America to adopt what's called LEED Platinum as their standard of performance. And they developed their own municipal-owned wind utility near, you could see it from downtown, that generates 5 times the energy the town consumes, and they sell then 4/5 back to the grid for some income for the community. And they have an integrated wastewater management system. They have a K-5 school that's setting new records all over Kansas for education and for their students, and it's changed the trajectory of that community. So here we're on Main Street. The little square way in the back is that grain elevator now peaking above the new downtown. And what you see here is native landscape. So why native landscape? Because these plants, unlike our drug-dependent rugs, we think of as sod, these plants have roots that are 17 feet deep. And they take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it in the soil where it belongs and build more topsoil. They become perfect habitat for pollinators. And they manage stormwater. Because it puts that stormwater along with the nutrients back into the soil where it belongs. As President Obama said, he was very complimentary about both Presidents Bush and Obama gave the town and us awards for doing this, as did the Urban Land Institute and the Financial Times. We all had to fly to England to collect our awards from the Financial Times. They were saying this community is setting a new standard for living in this century and into the future. So, also that in my view, well, I should say this, Emmanuel Cleaver, our congressman, got very interested in this work, and he started going to the places we were working, like New Orleans. And he went to one of Brad Pitt's fundraisers for a project we were doing in the lower Ninth Ward. And he kept saying, Bob, I really would like to take the leadership in Kansas City to Greensburg, Kansas. If I rent a bus, would you organize a presentation for them, and we'll take them out and show them what's happening? And I said, no, it's a bad idea. But he is my congressman, and he's convincing, and so we did. And fortunately, by that time, Discovery Channel had been filming our work 24/7 from day one. So we had a lot of film. And so we edited that, and on the way there, they watched the story on TV screens on the bus. So by the time they got there, they knew a lot about the place. And then they met the people, and they saw what had happened and what they were doing and what their vision was. And they came back after a meal with the community. We drove back, and they were pretty much on fire. And one of our elected officials said, Bob, it's too bad every community can't have a disaster like this. And I thought, oh my God. And it occurred to me, and I shared with her, that the truth is every community does have a man-made disaster like that. We shouldn't wait for an event to expose it. We should be calling the same questions in our community all the time and start addressing them before they become exposed after this kind of major natural disaster. And so on the bus ride back, they started debating about which community in Kansas City was the most disadvantaged, the most at risk. And by the time we arrived, they had decided it was historic Manheim Park east of Troost, from about 36th to 47th, roughly. And they extracted a commitment from me that we would work as volunteers with that community to do exactly what we were done in these communities that had experienced a natural disaster. And so that's exactly what we did in this community. This is the Bancroft School that had been empty for 20 years in the middle of their neighborhood. So this is pretty typical. Here's Troost. This is historic Manheim Park. This is Hyde Park and South Hyde Park. And you can see just from these dots the difference in race. Now, if I have all the charts for this, I'm only showing you this one. But if I showed you education, jobs, income, addiction, they all look as shocking as this does. Because truth is that dividing line in our community today. When you look at the neighborhood itself, what you find, and this is it, what you find is half of the structures are missing. They've been removed by fire and demolition. And what you can't see there is half of the ones that were standing when we started were empty. I'll give you an idea about the conditions in the community. The blue square is a church where we met on Saturdays for about a year to develop this plan with them. And the yellow-orange is the school that you saw earlier, and you'll see it once more at least. So we went through this, what I now call community dialogue of discovery. It's like those three questions, only a deeper, over more time. And this everybody know Wordle? Is that familiar? No. It's a computer program that tracks all the words in a public conversation and keeps track of how many times each word is used, and it puts it through a process, and the size of the word relates to how many times the community used that word in the conversations. So it gives us a snapshot of what their priorities were, what they wanted to accomplish that they didn't have. And that becomes a design guideline for us about what we should be putting back. And one of the things they said is, as we were thinking about transforming this situation, if they could acquire and repurpose the school in the middle of their neighborhood, they thought that would be the most important thing to do, and that's what we did. So you can see it there with the new construction just starting. So the school got restored and is now a neighborhood community center. It has a computer lab in it, exercise, and then housing for elderly and for single moms in the school. And then these townhomes around are for other community families. This was all designed to the LEED Platinum level, again, the highest that can be certified. It has solar on the roof, so it generates a lot of its own power. It has community gardens. Here's the way it was when we started. Here's what it was just before they moved the furniture in, to give you an idea of the transformation physically. But probably more important is we trained a lot of the men who were in the neighborhood who didn't have educations and didn't have jobs. And those men helped build the school and the housing. And these men now have jobs. And they're pretty excited about that difference. And they become an influence in the rest of the community. Probably more important than that is the police department came 1 year after we opened the new school to announce that crime was down in historic Manheim Park more than 26% in the first year. And that's just a beginning indication. Phase 2 was acquiring some of those empty buildings and renewing them and making them available as affordable housing, which we've now done. Phase 3 was to start building new houses on the empty lots, which we don't have to do because the private sector moved in and is doing that for us right now. So check it out when you're out for a drive. Go to historic Manheim Park and see what it looks like.
Which street is Manheim on?
So if let's say 43rd and Troost. So if you're going north on Troost, you get to 43rd, turn right, and you're right in the middle of historic Manheim Park. And in 2 blocks, you'll see the school and you'll see all the stuff around it. Good question. Yeah, and please interrupt anytime you like. So I and 4 friends decided to take this model and create a development company that we call Kansas City Sustainable Development Partners. And one of our, not our first project, but one of our projects was to acquire the 2 Westport schools, Westport Middle School and Westport High School. One time Westport Middle School was the junior college, our first junior college. But we bought both of those schools and we have now finished the middle school north of the street. And we're now underway with the high school. But the middle school I conceived of and thought of as a center for community vitality. And so far we're off to a pretty good start. It is now currently the home for the largest co-working community in the region. Co-working is the new model for workspace, where you can have everything from a desk this size, unassigned, to your own private office. But more important, what you have is the access to the state-of-the-art technology, to all kinds of conferencing, local or regional or national or global. You have digital makerspace, which means you can create videos or anything you want to do. If you're starting up a new company and you're one person and you want to act like a big corporation, you're probably going to become a member at PlexPod, because we can make you look like a big successful organization for very little money, like $350 a month. So it's a good way to get started. It has also become the place, for example, Kauffman Foundation hosts what they call 1,000,000 Cups, which is a coffee once a month that's for entrepreneurs and inventors and startup organizations. They moved it to us, to PlexPod Westport Commons, and so now we host it. The mayor last year gave his State of the City address here, and so on. So it's also the new home for Cultivate KC, which is the best urban ag group in the community. So the chef in the restaurant and the farmers decide what they're going to grow, how it'll be processed, how it will be served, to create healthier food systems for our community. So, in spite of all the things I've shared, and there are many more obviously nationally and globally going on that are not unlike what I just shared, carbon today is not bent down like we anticipated it would, but in fact just last Saturday a week ago, at the Mauna Loa Observatory, we reached 415 parts per million, shockingly for the first time ever. I have to share that some of my scientist colleagues, and some of the most notable, believe it's already too late, that we've gone too far. We can no longer save human life on the planet. It's just a question of how long can we exist in a more minimal way. I don't happen to share that opinion, because I think they are scientists and they're estimating our ability to embrace change based on our historic ability to do that. And I think our ability is greater than we've ever demonstrated before. motivated. Yes.
Project Drawdown, have you looked at that?
Yes. The question is Project Drawdown, which is a book that's fairly recent, written by a series of experts and edited by my friend Paul Hawken, has assembled people who have created a strategy for reversing global warming. This is a very important concept and really good reference. It's kind of the best on the planet. Paul will be coming to Kansas City later this year to speak to the community about this subject, and I would encourage you to participate. It takes that kind. We have to address this from all aspects. You know, I've been working on it for a long time as the built environment, but my focus currently is much broader than that, and I'll share a little bit more in a minute about that. The truth is, we are surrounded by evidence that that's the case. And look at all these events. You know most of them. I don't have to explain them. The only thing up here that's not weather related, of course, is this, which in a way is equally important. Of course, that's the blue-red voting pattern. And I put it up there not about what your political persuasions are, but the fact that we no longer have the capacity to maintain a dialogue in this country. And the way all these communities I've worked with get to success is they get to the point where they can have a real dialogue. They can exchange ideas that really matter to them, that may be shocking to some or not to others, but they can enter into conversation, open, and come to a new decision by virtue of being in that dialogue. And we've lost that as a country, and part of what, now I'm figuring out, what Leon Shenandoah and Robert Mueller were telling us is that we have more capacity for that here than they had seen anywhere else. So Einstein talked about this, how we get locked in these old patterns and we will require, as he said, substantially a new manner of thinking if we are to survive. I believe that. And I think that we have that capacity, but we have to exhibit it, and we have to do it now. We can no longer kick the can down the road if we want people to continue to be successful on this planet. And so it takes significant change. I've been playing with this idea myself. So recently on the beach, I started thinking, well, what if I turned my world upside down? And it occurred to me, if I could do that on a regular basis, there might be some good things associated with it. The first is I've spent 30 years trying to reduce my footprints, my environmental footprints. So if I stand on my hands, my footprints went away entirely. So I for the first time, would have succeeded. Secondly, I think it's really important that we think about all of us. You know, the word sustainability has been a big word since 1992 at the first Earth Summit. And I was there debating not to use that word, but I lost. And it's been the word we've used ever since. And it was a bad choice in the beginning, because sustainability implies we want to sustain what we currently have. And what we currently have is not working. Or to put it another, doing less bad. And we have to go beyond doing less bad to doing something positive, something change-making, something really net value increase. And so standing on my head allows me to do those things sort of automatically. And the other thing is it puts my heart above my head, which I think is another fundamental. That's one of the flaws we have had up to now, is a lot of this comes from, I would argue it started with Bacon and Descartes, but it certainly, no matter who you think originated the idea, it comes from Western scientific thought, which fueled the Industrial Revolution. But when you look at all those elements in the Industrial Revolution, even our gross national product is a good example. Gross national product measures the flow of money. There's nothing about resources in the equation, including human resources, including natural resources. So the GNP can look great if we're making lots of products and selling them at high profits. But we could be destroying the earth and the natural resources that allow us to make those products. Or, as we have done for a century, polluting the environment to trigger climate change, which reduces our capacity from making those things happen. So, starting to think more with our heart and let that inform how we spend time using our brains might be beneficial. I'm going to share just a couple of stories with you that I think start demonstrating that. The first is KCI. So first of all, full disclosure, I designed the terminals that we're now tearing down. I was the mayor's co-chair for the aviation committee that recommended that we take down the terminal and replace it with new terminals. And I know a lot of you, just from averages, I spent a lot of time, love those terminals. But since 9/11, they just don't work. They do not accommodate. They're very inefficient as a direct result. And if you are a traveler or you're a business person trying to bring business into the community, they can be embarrassing. So, for example, when the Republican Party was thinking about having their national convention here, the city made the decision not to take the risk of flying them into KCI. They flew them into the old airport. Right? So, at any rate, we're going to get a new terminal. It's underway. Its performance is required by ordinance to be LEED Gold, which is pretty good. But LEED Gold is still just doing less bad. So what I have talked to the mayor about, and the two mayoral candidates, and more importantly, the city manager and the aviation department, and the city manager hosted a team meeting. He flew all the development team and architects in from all over the country, and we met in his office, and I outlined the following. And that is that we would raise the performance of the new terminal from LEED Gold to net positive energy. That's a pretty big kick up. And they appropriately pushed back and said, well, Bob, that's a big idea, but, it sounds expensive, and we've just had a budget cut, so we're... And I made the case that we, BNIM, have a number of projects that perform at that level at no additional cost, and some were actually a reduction in cost. And one of their team members, who's responsible for performance, who flew in from Washington, acknowledged that that was the case. She knew the projects, and she thought that was relevant. But they all acknowledged that isn't where they were. They asked for a few weeks to go back and reconsider, and they're about due to fly back into town to say what they can do. Whatever they can do, they will do better than they currently had planned to do. Over and above that, we've talked to the aviation department about changing their fleet from diesel and gasoline, which it currently is, all the buses and trucks, etc., to electric. And then we take part of the airport, and there's about 5,000 acres of land that's not developed as part of the airport. It's rented long-term leases to farmers. Take part of that land and create a renewable energy farm that would power all the airport operations. If they did that, we would be the first climate positive airport on the planet. We would accommodate for all the carbon but for the planes taking off and landing. Now if we take part of the remaining land, part of the remaining 5,000 acres, and convert that to regenerative agriculture, that would more than consume the carbon from those aircraft. It would consume some of the carbon in our atmosphere and put it back in the soil, manufacturing more topsoil, creating pollinator habitat, creating healthy food, and a new economic system for our community, and it would be the pilot at the airport. So people flying in and leaving would be aware of that and could be eating it in the terminal if they chose to do so. I'm going to give you some examples because some of those things may be...
Before you leave, where are you talking about? On that picture? In the southwest quadrant?
Yes, all the land you see to the top left is owned by the city, but undeveloped. All the land down here and even beyond, and here and beyond, is owned by the city, but undeveloped, under lease to farmers. In fact, the Hart Forest, which is right about here, as a result of me negotiating with a farmer 30 years ago, or whatever it was, to work out a deal to have land to plant that Hart Forest. So it's very doable if we choose to do it. So renewable agriculture. One of the reasons we have just the right amount of carbon in the environment. It's just in the wrong place. Way too much of it in the atmosphere, which is creating global warming. Not enough of it in the soil. Our topsoil is depleted from our agricultural practices. So if we can find a way to get it out of the atmosphere into the soil, we have a chance. And by using the kind of plants that Wes Jackson uses at the Land Institute, where they have these deep roots and it never require plowing or pesticides or herbicides or fertilizers or watering, the foods that come from those plants then are doing multiple jobs. The plant itself is sequestering carbon, manufacturing topsoil, managing water, putting nutrients in the soil while it produces food. It's not requiring tractors and so on to come around with all the stuff that we currently deliver in our industrial farming practices. I'll give you some examples. Wes and his colleagues at the Land Institute have produced an alternative for wheat that's called kernza. And you can buy bread today from Lawrence made of kernza. It's really tasty. But probably a more symbolic thing is you can buy long root ale, which is made by Patagonia Provisions. It's kind of hard to get here, but if you have one in your hand, if you read the label basically says the magic sauce here is the Land Institute's alternative for wheat. They have figured out how to get carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil where it belongs. Sorry we can't give you a tax credit for it, but it's a damn good beer. There are other examples, like these beef sticks, like this bison and cranberry meat snacks from Pine Ridge, the Native American community. This is only bison and cranberries, a natural preservative. Really tasty. No other products. So all of these come from landscapes that have these deep roots. So while we're eating this healthy food, we're also preserving the soil and sequestering carbon. I think all that's possible at KCI if we choose to do the right thing. I just met last week with a lot of stakeholders like the Industrial Development Agency, the Economic Development Council, and a number of environmental groups like the Nature Conservancy, the Land Institute, Deep Roots, about the Blue River Valley. So the Blue River Valley, as you may know, starts here in Johnson County, winds its way around the city, and enters the Missouri east of downtown Kansas City. It's 270 square miles, 21 cities. It is an environmental disaster. Early pictures of the Blue River east of Kansas City showed houseboats and restaurants on a pristine river. And then we started developing out here, J.C. Nichols and others, unintentionally sending a lot of spring waters toward the Blue River on the Missouri side. And it started flooding. And pretty soon the houseboats and the restaurants couldn't hang out there anymore. It was too expensive for them to keep rebuilding. So they left. Then it was cheap land, and then industry came. Sheffield, Armco, the U.S. Army, etc. And so it became an industrial area. Then the industry collapsed, taking all the neighborhood surrounding it with them. And now if you drive that same area, it looks like a waste zone. And I'm working on one of those sites, the former Army facility, which is a Superfund site. 20 acres, 1.5 million square feet of facilities that was late in its career involved in chemical warfare. They weren't making the weapons, they were making the defense systems against weapons, but they had to use those chemicals to prepare the right defense. And guess what they did with the excess chemicals? Right? In the soil, and that soil is creating a flume en route to the Blue River. So we have we've done about $10 million worth of work on it. Now we have another 30 to go before you can inhabit it again. So we could, if we chose, and that's what was the conversation last week, we could set new guidelines for how redevelopment would happen along that entire Blue River and all those 270 square miles and all those 21 cities, and we would, just as we have done at KCI, hopefully, knocking on wood, create a model for living in the future. So that's what's possible. And I'll just close with this, back to Bucky, my mentor. Bucky always said, Bob, the only way to make significant change is to make the thing you're trying to change obsolete. So clearly, here's an example of that. When these came out, they didn't have to do a lot of marketing. Everybody knew this was one hell of a lot better than a dial phone. The same is true with how we design and build our food system, our economy, our neighborhoods, and our infrastructure. So I believe if we start doing, as I've just described at KCI and in the Blue River Valley, we won't have to market it. We will find in a really short period of time, as people in Greensburg and elsewhere, that that's just a better path, and everybody wants to take that path rather than the one they're currently on.